Okay, so because the Dallas Cowboys are playing tonight, I decided to just record a message for you today showing you how to get started with Spring Boot and create a basic Spring Boot project for lesson 10. This will be just a start on the lesson 10. It's not the full lesson 10, but this is probably about 50-75% of lesson 10. So let's get started. Create a new project. For the first time, we're going to use this Spring Initializer option here. Verify your SDK is Java 10. And you'll notice it says the initializer service URL is start.spring.io. That's the default. We go next. Change the group to edu.ecccd. Change the artifact to lesson 10 with a lowercase l. Instead of using Maven on this project, I want to give you some experience using Gradle. Gradle does very similar things to Maven. A lot of people like it, but it's not used quite as much as Maven. So, but I want to give you some experience. We'll be using Java, of course. Nice thing about Spring is you can create a web application with just a jar file. You don't have to create a WAR file. And we're going to be using version 10. Well, I want to take a snapshot off the version, and everything else is just fine. There's your full package name. Hit next. This is the actual initializer options, the various components that Spring Boot can bring together for you. I'm going to select DevTools and Lombok. Under Web, I'm going to select Web, which uses the Spring MVC. Under Template Engines, I'm going to select Timeleaf, and that's all we need for this one. Lesson 12 will also get JPA and H2, but for right now, these are the 4 things we need for lesson 10. Next, here, make sure you change the project name to have a capital L and verify the location of the project before you proceed. Press finish, and there is a lesson 10. All right, so after you click finish there, instead of giving that one message that you just saw, I have fixed things. We want on this screen, this is import the module from Gradle. We want to use auto import, create directories for empty content roots, and use everything else can remain exactly the same. Now, honestly, I don't know what this means. I haven't been able to get around it. So to get around it, I'm going to change this to okay, where's 11? Okay, we got around it. No big deal. You most likely will not get that error. And we are using 10, so we got around that error. I don't know what it is. Okay, so down here, Gradle is doing the initial build, and it's bringing all your components together, etc., your dependencies. If we look under lesson 10, we see a .gradle directory, which you don't need to worry about. Here is the Gradle wrapper folder. You don't have to worry about that. We have a build Gradle file. This is the the exact comparable. It is comparable to the pom.xml file, but again, it's not XML. It's just a script here. This shows that we're using the Spring Boot version 2.1.0 release, which is the current one. It shows the class path is for the Spring Boot Gradle plugin for that particular release. It applies a plugin Java. Eclipse, I'm not sure why it says Eclipse, but it's okay. And says it's apply the Spring Framework Boot in Spring Dependency Management. You notice the group has been changed, the version has been changed, source compatibility is 10. It uses Maven Central to bring in all the dependencies from, rather than having its own set of dependencies. Down here are the individual dependencies that Spring Boot selected for you as a result of the things that you selected on the initializer. Here's Timeleaf, the starter for Timeleaf, the starter for web. There's DevTools and Lombok. And for testing purposes, here's the Spring Boot starter test. That's it's comparable to the pom.xml file. Next, let's look at the source. You have a main and a test, and under those you have Java. And under Java, you got the edu.dcd.10, edu.dcd.lesson10 under test also, and it generated you two programs. One is the lesson 10 application. This is, you won't be changing this, but basically it's our good old familiar public static void main, and it executes the Spring application.run, and that's the way Spring gets started. The test is pretty much empty. It runs with the Spring runner, which is part of the Spring Boot test starter. And then here's the Spring Boot test annotation. And then the only test is it does context loads, which means it basically starts the Spring framework up and verifies everything starts and then shuts it down. That's all it does right here. You can add additional tests to this if you want. We won't for now. So let's close that, and let's close this. Because what we want to do is go to lesson 10 and create our own Java class. I'm going to put it in a folder called controllers, and we're going to call it Hello World Controller. Okay, and now we want to annotate this, and you in your exercise you probably will just use the controller annotation, but for this I'm going to use REST controller because I'm not going to have an actual web page, so I use REST controller instead. Here we need actually it can be private, I believe. And now let's make it public. Public void say hello. We need to annotate this method with something called @request mapping, and it has a parameter of the URL that's going to execute it. You'll remember the URL pattern in the servlet exercise and the web.xml. Well, this is the same sort of thing. That's the URL that you'll enter to make this happen. And here we're just going to return the string hello Spring Boot. Okay, and that's all we need. And now if we got something here that good old semicolon. Okay, now what? To return that value, you got to return a string. Okay, now we're happy. So now we're going to, you notice that the lesson 10 application up here in the run box. So let's just run it. That's going to go through and build the application and start up Spring. So notice it executing the Java, and then here's the Spring startup. It's similar but different from the one we had in the last chapter. Do notice that it does start Tomcat on port 8080 because we specified web, and notice initializes the Spring embedded web application. Notice the servlet, dispatch servlet. Okay, so we are using servlets. I told you that that's the basis of all Java web applications. And Tomcat started on 8080 and it started the application. And now if I flip over to a browser and enter localhost 8080, there's the Hello Spring Boot that came from our program. Hello Spring Boot. And if you don't believe me, I'll put in Hello Spring Boot World, and we will quickly restart the application. It shuts it down, and Spring will then restart after it rebuilds that one class. It's already started, and we'll come back over here and we refresh, and it says Hello Spring Boot World. Now again, I did a REST controller because I don't have an HTML file to render this message in, and by making it a REST controller, it just took that message and put it out in the browser. But in your lesson 10, you will create a couple simple HTML files. And you'll use Timeleaf, and will actually display a message that you enter. So that's basically all there is to Spring. Notice how simple it was to create this web application. If you had to do this with a servlet, it would take you a while because you'd have to use the web XML and set it all up, and this is a lot simpler. I'll show you though the web application test, and if we run the test, it goes through the same startup, make sure everything works, and then shuts it down. There it goes, starting up, instantiating the test, and there's Spring, and it goes through all the initialization and then shuts down. It says that the context loads test pass. Well, that's because there wasn't anything to actually happen, but it actually ran the test with the Spring runner. So that's how to create a simple Spring Boot application. Spring Boot is basically the front end of Spring. It allows you to select those dependencies that you want, such as the developer tools and Lombok and web and Timeleaf, and later on JPA and H2, and then Spring Boot creates the project. But then when we open up the project here in IntelliJ, we have a Spring application basically. Spring Boot has just created the basic application for you. But when we run it, etc., it's all using the Spring framework. So that's all I wanted to show you tonight. And the only thing I will leave you with is go Cowboys, and talk to you later. Bye-bye.